All right, so hello everybody. Welcome to the Ecosystems Study Group. And this is, my name is Jim Lawrenson, and I'm one of the sort of co-founders of this group. We started this back in 2017. Oh my God. The purpose was to use systems framing or systems thinking to better understand the root causes of climate change and biodiversity loss and all the other planetary boundaries that many of which we have overshot in terms of Earth's carrying capacity. And we are trying to study, though, of course, not to be too pessimistic, the best ways to address our predicament. And given that our origins are in the Unitarian Universalist congregation called Cedar Lane, and have this great little website that I think you're saying, we are very interested, of course, in the most sort of our moral and ethical response to our predicament. Our goal has been to educate ourselves, the local activist groups, the local officials, and especially given our rather prominent location in the universe and the many movers and shakers in this area. That's basically it. You can find out more at this website. I won't scroll down, but we do have a very active Google group, and you can click on the link there to join us if you'd like. We are actually one of about 20 groups in what's called it's the very active Montgomery County Climate Coalition. Very surprised if we don't have at least 10 of our groups represented.
That's wonderful.
Dr. Treseder is an American ecologist who specializes in the interplay between global climate change and fungal ecology. She also serves as a member. I don't know how you managed to put all this into your life, but you're a member of the Irvine City Council after being elected in 2022. She is currently a full professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California in Irvine. She is also a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science and the American Academy of Microbiology and the Ecological Society of America. And here's just a fun little point is, I think you are one of the youngest undergrads to co-author, to be first author, actually, of a research paper published in perhaps the most prominent journal on the planet, Nature, and was featured on the cover of that issue. So
yeah, that was fun.
Serious cred. And then since then, you've been publishing, my gosh, 90 at least peer-reviewed scientific papers that have been cited over 19,000 times. So you know your stuff. And of course, one of our big questions is the one of, then why are you wanting to be a county council member?
Okay, so yeah, I am an ecosystem ecologist, which is why I love the name of your group, and I study endangered ecosystems. So that includes like the cloud forests in Costa Rica and the northern forests in Alaska. I study the coast redwoods up in Northern California. I don't know if any of you have ever read the book Overstory, but that's basically like almost exactly what we do, except for the tree sitting. We don't do that. And yeah, and then just all of the ecosystems around here, which are very endangered. And you know, I've been studying climate change since I was an undergrad. Very interested in how climate change affects these ecosystems. And like I can tell you, like when I first started working up in Alaska, it was 1999. And I always wanted to get up there right as the soil thaw was happening at the beginning of the growing season. And over time, I had to keep going up earlier and earlier and earlier in the year. And it became really clear to me that climate change is actually happening now. I remember when I was an undergrad, we thought the climate change was happening, but it was going to be so subtle that we wouldn't really pick up on it in our lifetimes, but now, of course, we know that's not the case. So I was thinking, like, for most of my career, like, well, I'll just do this research, do like these experiments on climate change, figure out what's going on, publish it in the scientific journals, and then somehow the policymakers would find that information and know what to do about that, and then enact the laws and the policies that we needed, and then everything would be great. And, of course that didn't happen. And then, it started getting to be like 2017, 2018, and I was like, okay, I just can't count on the government like taking the action that I think we need at the speed that we need it. So I tried to figure out what to do about it. And I started just doing my own advocacy. I went out into the community and asked city council members and US representatives, like everybody I could ask, like, do something. I found out that city council members can actually do a lot. Like, that's where the rubber hits the road, like you're dealing with a lot of really practical things. You're dealing with budgets that affect your residents, and you're dealing with how the roads are constructed and mass transit and solar panels and all these things. And we're also very available. Like, I don't know about in Massachusetts, but like in California, like anybody can come and speak to the city council for 3 minutes. And, as long as it relates to what the city council does, and we have to sit there and listen to it, no matter what they're saying.
Maryland, by the way, just to.
Oh, sorry, gosh,
No,
Maryland.
that's okay.
Nah, sorry, it was an M. Sorry, sorry about that. Okay, that explains why you were interested in DC. All right, excellent. Okay, so I don't know if you do that in Maryland, but it's just a way that we can be really approachable. And so I ended up deciding that I would need to run. Like, I got tired of trying to convince the city council members to do what I hoped for. It was such a lift. Even the ones that said they were environmentalists, they'd agree, but then they wouldn't actually do it. And so I decided to run. And so I took a training program. They taught me how to fundraise, which is the most important thing. And I got clued into the political system here and ran and won for the first time candidate. It was really great. And I've been serving on the council since mid-December. So really hit hard on the environmental policy, like, I'm happy to tell you about that, like how, what our priorities are and how we're approaching it, and all that. Challenges, things that were easier than I thought. Happy to address all of those questions. But I will just say overall, I love it. Like, I love my work, I love my research, and I love being on the city council. It's just both of those things are so fulfilling, and I can really make a lot of change in both ways. And so even though I'm working it's basically 2 full-time jobs, it energizes me. So, okay, so those are the foundational things. And then I think that you probably all have a lot of things you want to know about from me.
Well, so here I'm going to actually turn this over to Patty McGrath, as she's a longtime member of the Ecosystem Study Group. Well, go ahead and introduce yourself, Patty, and then take it there.
Yeah, my name's Patty McGrath. I live in Potomac, Maryland, and I am a member of the Ecosystem Study Group and Elders for Climate Action and the Montgomery County Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions, and the Chesapeake Organization, Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, and it's a long list. Not as many as your scientific papers, but anyway. So I'm very interested in following up on what you just said about what your priorities and your challenges are, because basically in December of 2017, a number of people, some of them from this group, worked very, very hard to get the Montgomery County Council to declare a climate emergency. And we thought, as you thought, okay, we got the emergency, they declared it, now they're going to do things right.
Yes.
No. It made no discernible impact. That I don't think anybody here has a discernible impact they can bring up that the council did something because of the climate emergency. The zoning has not been influenced or revised in any way. The building of roads, the development of real estate, plowing down mature forests to build rows of townhouses. And I mean, we do need housing, but there are other ways. So like, that's where we are. And
Yeah.
I would love to hear where you are.
Well, yeah, so I experienced like, yeah, just you said the same thing. And that's how I learned about greenwashing. Unfortunately. And so back before I was on the council, I was on the city's Green Ribbon Environmental Committee. And so, we would advise the council on policy, environmental policy. And one of the things we asked them to do was to take a pledge for the city to be carbon neutral by 2030. Like, so everything within its borders. And they did. They voted unanimously and very enthusiastically. And I was like, well, this is amazing. All right, well, that's such a heavy lift. It's just really, it's bold, but I think potentially doable, like at that time. But they're going to be right on it, I'm sure. And then nothing happened, and nothing happened, and nothing happened. And it turns out, now that I'm on the council, I found out that behind the scenes, like, they all voted for that in the meeting. And then they went right after that and told the city manager, hey, don't do any of this. Like, we don't want to do it. We're just, yeah, like, it was just to make the vote. And so we were imagining that it was being slowed down, and we were right. And so that is one of the challenges. So once I got on the council, we took a look at it, and at that time, it wasn't going to be possible to meet the carbon neutrality goal by 2030, but we're hoping maybe we can get maybe 40% of the way there, which still would be phenomenal. And so there's so many things that we can do. That's one of the issues, is like, we've got to install solar panels. We got to make sure that everybody's using 100% renewable energy. We've got to make sure that our transportation system is green. We've got to make sure that our housing, which we definitely need to build, is also green and is built in a way that it encourages mass transit and walkability and stuff like that. It's such a heavy lift, and then people come out of the woodwork, and like representatives of different companies saying like, well, we can help you, make a contract with us, buy our product, we'll install it, and blah blah. And it's just very easy to get distracted, or go for the things that seem like they would look best on a bumper sticker, I guess. Like doubling the number of trees in the city. Perfect, everybody loves trees. It's not going to fix the problem fundamentally. So what we're doing now is we've hired a consulting firm to build a climate action plan for us. And this is something that the state of California requires all cities to have, but that hardly any cities actually do, because they're just not prosecuted for it if they don't comply with the law. So, and our city didn't have one. And so the idea behind the plan is that this consulting firm is taking like a long time, maybe 8 months or so to develop it. And so the first thing they did was they did an inventory of all the greenhouse gas production that we're releasing from the city and where it's coming from, like how much is from transportation, how much is from buildings, how much is, whatever. And that took a fair bit of time, but that's really important, because then we know where to target things. Like, we want to invest our money and our energy where the biggest sources are. And then after that, then we need to figure out what the solutions are. And so we have a list now, I think, of like a menu of maybe 80 things that the city can do to reduce its impact. And then we also have a number, like how much would each item reduce our greenhouse gases. And what we don't have associated with that is the cost for each item. So we got to work on that. And so now what we're doing is we're showing this menu to all of our community members and stakeholder groups and saying like, which ones do you want to see here? Now you see like this will have a big impact on our greenhouse gases, but might be more expensive or might be less convenient for you. Like, what do you want? Same thing with the developers, the restaurant industry, like all these things. That's a pretty heavy lift. And so that is one of the challenging things. Of course, nobody agrees on what they want. We're finding more agreement than I thought, but it's pretty tough. And nobody wants to be inconvenienced. That's for sure. Even people who really care about the environment don't want to be inconvenienced. So we're doing that. And then we also found we have to change a number of like county policies and other things. There's just really esoteric things like how our utility taxes are handled or how affordable housing, the utility costs are determined, that we have to then go in and talk to the county government and ask them to make those changes. So, so it's really, really challenging. But that's how we're trying to identify the priorities, both in terms of how we can meet our goal and then also what our community is willing and able to do. So I hope that that is an initial answer, and then I'm happy to elaborate on anything that anybody wants. Or answer any other questions.
That's great. I guess I don't think any of us is ready to run for county council, and we would only be one of 11.
Right.
But have you, what is your experience in dealing with other county council members?
Yeah.
As far as they obviously can't know as much about it as you do. So
I hope not, because I spent so much time on it. But yeah, so I have 4 colleagues on the council, and so we definitely have to get to 3 on anything. And I'll say that it's been remarkably easy to get to 3. I mean, just about everything I bring forward is unanimously passed. And even if it's not unanimously passed, it's like passed 4-1 or something like that. And I think part of it is that it is very hard for them to say that I don't know what I'm talking about, like for the most part. And like, what can they do? I mean, they can definitely argue that I don't know the needs of a particular community. That is for sure. But in terms of like the science or the technology, like they have a hard time with that. Second, our city population is way environmental. Like in terms of issues of interest, it's like at the top 1 or 2 always. We have this university here. A lot of our alums just stay in the community. And then also, you know, something like 1/3 of our residents have advanced degrees. So they really genuinely believe in science. And like if they say like the majority of scientists are saying this, then they tend to believe that. And so that's why, so it's been relatively easy. I'm always worried that what happened before will happen again, where we'll get something that's passed, but then behind the scenes, the council members will say like to the city manager, don't actually do that. Luckily I have a good relationship with my city manager, and every once in a while I check with him and he says no. And I mean, he did start a whole new department in the city, and he's hiring a bunch of people to do what we're asking. So it's been good. The only thing is though, the challenging part with my colleagues is that, oh my gosh, this is a long story, but I'll try to go into it a little bit. One of the things that I advocated for as just like a civilian was the formation of this alternate power agency that would be separate from the utility. So here we have like these monopolies. I don't know about you. We have monopolies that are private utilities. And if a city wants to, though, it can break its relationship with the monopoly and set up its own power agency where the city can decide where to buy the power. You know, you want to buy it from a wind farm, go ahead, buy it from a wind farm. You can, you know, have your city be 100% renewable energy, like really quickly that way. And so we advocate for that. We got it set up. 4 cities actually in Orange County, including Irvine, agreed to form this agency. We were so excited. We were like, this is amazing. They even said, okay, we'll have the default product be 100% renewable energy. So everybody, like literally on one day in the whole city, just switched over to 100% renewable energy in these 4 cities. It was remarkable.
Wow.
Yeah. And so we were so psyched. But the problem was that the agency, like right as it was getting started, got taken over by a bunch of people who were really corrupt, it turns out. And what they saw was an opportunity to funnel some of the income that they get from the residents to their own people. And so they were setting up contracts with people who had no expertise in the area. There was nothing documented. We don't know why they were getting the contracts or how much. And it was just terrible. Well, it turns out the FBI is investigating them now, and I think some other federal agencies. And oh my gosh, it was so frustrating. And a couple of those people are my colleagues on my city council. And so what we had to do is, that was one of the reasons that I ran for office, is I wanted to get on the city council and get on that board and try to clean it up. And so it took like a year, but we now have, I think, gotten rid of all those bad actors, and it's operating very cleanly in multiple ways. And so that's wonderful. But then the reputation of the agency has really taken a hit. So now most people, when they hear about our agency, they think it's corrupt still. So that has been one of the major challenges, was just that I was not prepared to have this effort be co-opted by people who wanted to make a buck. And looking back, I should have been more prepared for that. But I wasn't involved in politics, and I didn't know.
Yeah, there are vultures in every ecosystem. Ta-da.
Yeah, right.
Jim has some questions he'd like to, I guess, we should start with them, Jim.
Okay.
I've talked to a lot of people, and they are very, yeah, I wouldn't say depressed necessarily, but they don't have a lot of hope. How do you keep your hope?
Oh, it's really hard. So yeah, you've heard of probably climate grief or climate anxiety.
Yeah, we studied it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's awful. And so I definitely, I've had it for a long time. So studying the climate. So I think I've gotten used to it a little bit, just in that sense. But then I think what really, just in terms of the climate anxiety, one of the things that really, there were two things that really made me think, like, I cannot wait any longer, even though I'm very shy and I don't like attention and I don't like public speaking, I'm going to run for office. One was my students. They, when I'd be teaching, they would get so upset. Especially when the US signaled it was going to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Like I watched that announcement live with the students. It happened to be during my lecture, and just watching their faces, they were going to cry. They were so upset. And I'm like, I've got to do something. And then the second thing was, I read a new study at the time that came out, and it said that it was by some climate modelers down in the Middle East, and they said they figured out that by the end of this century, they expect that the climate around Kuwait and the Persian Gulf would be uninhabitable for people. Like it would be humid enough and hot enough for prolonged enough periods of time that it's not physiologically possible for our human to keep themselves cool. So just thinking about all the people who would be having to move out of that area, and then what that would mean for the rest of the planet. And then also people who would be able to move. There's a lot of people who are not movable, like kids, women, people who are not well off, they would just die. And so that's one of the reasons I got so motivated to run for office. So there's that. But then also it was really traumatic, like trying to face this lack of inaction from the city council and not knowing why and not being able to address it for that reason. And then, yeah, seeing this corruption happen to something that I thought was a wonderful, wonderful thing that I felt like was my baby. And so it's been an emotional journey for me. I get a lot of therapy in general because of it. And, but I will say that getting it turned around is very gratifying. And I wasn't alone. Like there are so many community members who are right there also being very concerned and outraged and all that we were able to support one another through it. And I've made some really, really good friendships just going through all that with them. I know who I trust and who I don't, which is very helpful. And I hope that I'm wiser for it. I'm hoping that I can head off those sorts of situations in the future where things can get co-opted by bad actors. Yeah.
It was something that we definitely think about a lot. And you're right. I mean, you can't just give up, because then you're going to ensure that things are going to collapse. So at least we can perhaps help to some extent. So that's, I think, somewhat of our mantra. And in fact, it was one of the reasons that we're the latest member of the Montgomery County Climate Coalition. We dragged our feet. We kept, we're just scientists. We want to do that. We eventually said, yeah, we got to do something. So we joined.
I agree, and I think that well, actually, one of my grad students and I and some collaborators actually worked on climate anxiety and how to address it with the students. And the insidious thing about it is you're right, like you get paralyzed. You think, well, there's nothing I can do to make a difference, so why should I do anything? And then, of course, if everybody across the planet says that, then nothing happens. So I really like Greta Thunberg's quote that was, the one thing we need more than hope is action. And that's because where there is action, hope will exist. And so I think that is really helpful for me. I just try to take action when I'm feeling down.
Okay, so now speaking of action, so the first question that somebody sent in from Emmanuel Wagner asked, so noted that Irvine is leading in the hydrogen RD&D and including home to, I don't know if it's the first H2 fueling station. And I guess they've been doing this for 20 years already. So what do you think Maryland cities could learn from something like that? Is this something that we can come and study and do something with?
Yeah, well, I think that probably it's owing to the university. So we have a really great fuel cell lab here at UCI, and they've gotten really good funding. And they've been able to develop a lot of these technologies. And I think the hydrogen fueling station is here on campus. It was like when it was very early. It was installed very, very early. And so that's wonderful. I think that hydrogen's, yeah, really important, as probably a lot of you know, for these purposes where you need like a lot of energy per unit weight or volume, like on a plane, sometimes on a semi truck or something like that, although hopefully we'll be able to deal with that. Big container ships are going across the ocean. I think hydrogen, it has a really important role to play there. But I think a lot of it is because of the university. I imagine that you have a lot of universities nearby. But yeah, I think it's mostly just the funding came in through there.
On the other hand, we have studied a lot of the energy sources and how much really one can scale up to the kind of energy use that we have now, which is then, of course, brings in a lot of what we mostly push is the need for some pretty massive contraction in energy use and consumption and that sort of thing to really get anything replacing what we currently are using that has such a carbon footprint.
I agree. Yeah.
And then, so we just have a few more questions from ones that came in, and then Ken will get to you and any others who have questions now. But so Kathleen Michaels had written in, how can we deal with plastics, which is something I used to like totally care about, and then I thought that's not that important anymore until I read her question, where she says, it is a huge driver of climate change at every stage of production and use and disposal. And just the sort of concept of we have this disposable world, to me, it's a perfect metaphor for so much of what we consume and just throw away because, we're done with it. It broke or something.
Oh yeah, that's correct. So I think first of all, you're right that it really does drive this consumer culture where it's like, if I want it like tomorrow. I'm going to order it from Amazon. It doesn't really matter like the long-term consequences of it. It's just, there's that like sense of convenience, I think, for a lot of people. And a lot of that is enabled by use of plastics. Two is that I don't know whether you all have noticed, but there's a lot more things that are plastic now that didn't used to be. So like furniture, for instance, like all sorts of things that used to be metal, all sorts of things that used to be wood are now plastic. And then you also have all these water bottles and, as you know, like the single-use plastics. And it's not like you're not imagining it. It's very real. It's actually increasing exponentially, the use of plastic. And that is because of the fossil fuel industry. Like, they are not dumb. They see what's coming down the pipeline, as it were, and they know that, we're switching over to EVs, and we're, reducing our use of fossil fuels. And so they need to have a market for their gasoline, for their fossil fuels. And so they can make plastic with it. So they've been really pushing, it's called plastification, the use of plastic to make things that used to be made of other things. And also pushing, the single-use plastics. And of course, that gets into the ocean. It takes energy to make all those things. When you all probably know, like when you get the plastic into the ocean or even out into the soil, it will disappear after a while. Like you won't see it, but it's all still there. It's just broken up into microscopic particles. And in fact, like every single toothbrush you have ever had in your life still exists on the planet as plastic. It's just dispersed. And people talk about those big islands of plastic in the Pacific and Atlantic and how they're bigger than Texas and all that. And people ask, like, yeah, clothing, exactly. People ask, like, well, why not just get some ships and like scoop it up with a net and take it? The answer is, like, it is not that simple, because that plastic is like, you see the big pieces of plastic, but then there's tons of little particles of plastic all around there where they're breaking down, and you just cannot get enough nets to pick that up. They just won't pick that up. And so it is a real problem. And then of course that goes into our food supply. I don't want to, like, just, yeah. And then that affects, that affects photosynthesis. So you don't have as much CO2 coming out of the atmosphere. So it is a problem. It's really a problem. And so one of the things that we're working on now is in the city is an ordinance banning single-use plastics in the food service. And the deal is that food service is, maybe you might have experienced during the pandemic, you order something to be delivered, which a lot of people do now, or pick up, and it has like a gazillion tiny little plastic containers. Like there's one for your ketchup. I got something from Chipotle where they had one of those little cutie tangerines, and it was in a plastic container. They're just big enough for the tangerine. I was like, ah. So anyway, so we are working on banning the plastics and requiring, if a restaurant really does have to use disposable containers, to use compostable plastics, and they have to have a certain certification, because a lot of places just say they're compostable and they're not really. And then also any food service, like a restaurant where they serve food in-house, that they need to use like reusable dishes and things like that, so that they can just wash them and reuse them. And so the nice thing is that we have models for cities that have done that. And even UCI, our campus, does that. So when students, if they want to get takeout from their dorm cafeterias, they check out a plastic reusable takeout container. It has a barcode on it. They get it, they eat their food, and then they turn it back in and scan the code, and then they get reimbursed for that container. So you can do it. And remarkably enough, we are not getting much pushback from different stakeholders here at our city as we're developing this ordinance. We did get an unhappy letter from some restaurants, but that was pretty much it. So I think it is entirely possible. But the idea is that like when we're dealing with single-use plastics, like going into the ocean or in our landfills or whatever, like we might be tempted just to try to clean it up, but that's like trying to mop up a bathtub that's overflowing. Like you turn off the tap first, like you turn off the tap and then you clean it up. Like we're just trying to turn off the tap. We don't want those produced.
So we've been studying biodiversity a lot lately, and regenerative agriculture, and partly that overlaps with our concerns about food security, because we want to sort of prepare for the worst also.
We do. Actually, one of my postdoc studies regenerative agriculture, and she works up in Central California. She came from migrant workers, and so really cares about that a lot, and so works with this small family growers up there. And yeah, I mean, it's tough. So there are a lot of different arguments for trying to preserve biodiversity. I mean, there's the moral one, which is that, is it really our place to wipe out another species? And a lot of people that resonates with, of course, but not everybody. One of the things that we've done a lot of work on in ecosystem ecology is trying to figure out if ecosystems are more stable, if they're more diverse. And so the idea there is that if you have a lot of different, say, plants that are living in an ecosystem, and they have different needs, like some might require a lot of water, some might require a little bit, and there's a mix of those different plants, then when you have a drought, then the ones that tolerate drought will still grow and support the ecosystem. If you have a flood, then the ones that can deal with the floods can still grow. And that's an oversimplified explanation, but that that can sometimes be a really powerful argument, especially for land managers. We'll talk with land managers in our area, and like they don't want to see like the land that they manage be overrun with locusts or pathogens or anything like that and killed. So they'll try to have genetic diversity and species diversity in there to try to head that off. What are some, there's like medicine. So we get a lot of something like the vast majority of the drugs that have been developed that we use come from plants, and a lot of them from very biodiverse areas like rainforests. And so it really helps to preserve biodiversity that way. Actually, this really, really important compound for chemotherapy for breast cancer came from a very, very small plant that happened to grow in coastal California, and it was fairly rare. And it just so happens that some sort of pharmaceutical company screened it, found out that it was very effective against breast cancer, and then was able to replicate those compounds in their labs. But if we hadn't had access to that particular species, we never would have gotten that treatment. And so I think there's just, depending on the stakeholder you're talking to or the goals of the group, like luckily there's a lot of different arguments for preserving biodiversity. But I mean, mine is that it's just delightful. I mean, it's just like, it's how fun to be able to go to different parts of the world and see different ecosystems. Like you don't want to go to different places and see the same weeds growing, and it's wonderful to see different birds or butterflies or whatever. It just makes life so much better.
It does, and I guess it's how can you get people not just accepting it, but really loving it the way I think a lot of ecologists do. And the one thing that really got me with Bill Reese was he kind of basically said, we know what to do. We have all sorts of great ideas on what to do. It's like how to do it, how to get people to.
You're right. I think there has to be the public will to do it ultimately. And yeah, I think a lot of that is education, and yeah, just trying to speak to people where they are. We all have different values. Like my values are very specific, and yeah, I already explained some of them. But I could be talking to someone across the table who does not care about that at all. That is not their value. I could try telling them that they should have my values, but they're not going to do it. I have to figure out what their values are and try to couch the argument that way, or it's just never going to happen.
I'd like to switch to the question after mine, and then if there's time, I'll do mine, because also Kenneth is waiting. Jane DeMarines asked, how can we get the problem of meat and animal agriculture more attention? And that is in line with the question that is also from Mary Rucker. She said, did any of the solutions, your 80 solutions, focus on getting agriculture, especially animal agriculture and non-organic produce farms, on the radar as major climate contributors? Are there any tips for policies that promote organic farming and train farmers to switch from animal farming to produce and stop subsidizing destructive farming? So that's, I'm sure that's a concern for a number of people who are here tonight.
Yeah, just very important. I think especially in the industrial farming and the industrial, animal husbandry and stuff like that. That there's so many sources of greenhouse gases involved there. I mean, one that I think a lot of people don't think about is the nitrogen. If you're adding a ton of inorganic nitrogen fertilizer to crops, like that gets converted right away to this like greenhouse gas that's made of nitrogen that goes right back up. and is a big problem, in addition to so many other things. So I think one of the things that we emphasize in our plan is that we need to take account for anything that happens even outside of our city if it's feeding into what we use in our inside our city. So inside our city, we don't have a lot of farms. We used to, but the city's, become very developed. It's very much a suburban Southern California neighborhood city. But we are eating that food. And so we need to take into account, like, that food is being grown in Iowa or in the Central Valley in California. And so the greenhouse gases that were produced from that food needs to be taken into account when we're considering carbon neutrality. And so there can be different, let's see, the problem is that we cannot tell people what food to buy or eat. Like, they will not go for that. But we can always give incentives. That's the thing. And so we are lucky in that we have fairly good resources in this city. And so we can always say, if say a store is going to be offering organic produce or organic products, that they will get a tax break, or that we will give them even a financial incentive or something like that per unit, like organic product sold or something like that. And that can really drive a lot of behavior in the stores anyway. And I think a lot of people, they're really prioritizing convenience, and they like the idea of not eating pesticides or other things like that. And so if they're able to get organic produce and it's right there and it's easy, and maybe subsidized, then I think they'll just go ahead and grab it. I don't think that the inorganic stuff or the greenhouse gas intensive products are actually necessarily preferred by people per se. So there is that. That is, I think, something that we've been considering. For sure, minimizing the consumption of meat and dairy and eggs is very helpful for sure. There's a lot of greenhouse gases, as you all know, produced there. That, I think, again, it's very hard to make people do that. But one of the things that I really like is when people are they're told, well, maybe you're not willing to go 100% vegan right now, but maybe you could be vegan before 5 p.m. every day or something like that. Or maybe there's Veganuary. I did Veganuary once, where you're just vegan for January and then see if you like it. I think it does take some of the pressure off people to feel well, I mean, I guess from what I understand from the psychological studies is that the people who don't want to go vegan or vegetarian, a lot of times it's just because they don't identify themselves with what they picture as a vegan. When they think vegan, they're picturing, probably the person in the wool hat, and the guy from college who was a stoner and all these things, and they're we're not one of them, we're not going to be vegan. But if it just becomes more of a mainstream thing where different people are trying it out and deciding if they like it or not, I think that helps. And so it might be kind of a gateway to get them to try it. If we say you don't need to be full vegan, you just be vegan some of the time. But yeah, so I think for our city, if we were to really try to tackle that, I think it would mostly be about messaging and trying to, I mean, not even necessarily appealing to the stats, because people don't really care about those unless they're already leaning that way anyway. But just saying look, people like you or your neighbors are vegan, give it a shot. We'll see.
But thank you. Thank you for that. I think I'd like to switch to Kenneth. I'm going to forego my question to Kenneth Crandall, who's been patiently waiting
Thank you, Kenneth.
his question.
Okay. Hi, thank you very much. I have two questions sort of on both ends of the spectrum. first I put one in the chat. It was, you talked about 80 solutions that you've looked at, but did a couple of them rise to the top of one way or the other? And are any of the ones that rose to the top ones that might be replicable in other counties or cities such as ours?
Yeah, that's the replicability and the scalability. That is something that we're really hoping for, because we're one of the better off cities in the county. And so what we're hoping is that if we put these ordinances and programs into place, then other cities can just copy and paste, basically. So the ones that seem like they'd be most effective in terms of just reducing the greenhouse gas numbers the most, one is switching everybody to renewable energy, which we have done. So our city is like, we use about 95.5% renewable energy now in our buildings. So that's really great. The other one that I was really surprised about, and I guess I shouldn't have been looking back, is food waste handling. So food waste, if it's disposed of in the like normal way where it's put into a landfill, it decomposes under anaerobic conditions. And so then that all that carbon turns into methane, which is something like 80 times more effective a greenhouse gas than CO2. And so that is actually, when we consider all the food that we, throw away in the city, that is like an astronomical amount of carbon dioxide equivalents. So one of the things that we are actually requiring now is for our residents to have their own separate food waste container. So they have their trash, recycling, and food waste bins that they put out during trash day. And they have to sort their food waste out into the food waste bin. And then that is taken to a site, a composting site in our city, where they just make huge, huge rows of this food waste. And then they go in and turn it regularly. And then it becomes compost. And then we give that away free to our residents. And so the residents come and get it. We like every day that we do a compost giveaway, there's like lines of cars and the compost gets taken up really fast. They'll go and put it back on their garden. They're able to grow their own food more, and et cetera, et cetera. And so that can be remarkably effective. The second thing that we need to do is get the cars off the road. So cars are 50% of our greenhouse gas production in the city. And that's going to be like, I think the hardest nut to crack. But what we are really working on is a series of protected bike lanes that we want throughout the whole city. So that our city is actually not big, like in terms of area. So people can bike, especially we have e-bikes. People can bike actually faster across the city than you can drive because the traffic's pretty bad. But people are not biking now because they don't feel safe. And that is valid because a lot of cars hit bikes. So we want to have those bike lanes that have the concrete barrier between the bikers and the cars. And so that, like, we could try to convert all of our cars to EVs, but that will not do it. That is not enough to cancel out our greenhouse gas productions. People need to feel free to bike. And walking too. It just so happens our neighborhoods are set up to be very, like, we each have our own little shopping center that we can walk to. And so we just need to make sure that people don't have to cross any intersections that seem unsafe to them. So we're working on that as well. So even just setting up bike lanes, not super expensive, but can make a big difference.
Okay, thank you. I'd love to be able to follow up on a couple of those, but not in detail here for this particular one. I'd like to ask the other end question, which is, it seems to me we're actually almost thinking too small, because it's like capitalism is the issue. It's the one that tells us to say, if I can afford it, I can do it. So I can buy a McMansion, or I can buy the plastic, I can do all the consumerism. And it's also, capitalism is the enemy of democracy, witness things like Citizens United. So do you agree with that? In which case, what can we or should we try to do, or is that a place to go after it?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And the more I get into like the actions that we need to take to fix this, the more I realize it's so hard to deal with consumerism and capitalism. I wish I had an answer for that. It's like so intractable. But what I will say is that one of the things that I have found and I think I touched on this before with the corruption, is I see how these systems get put in place and then how it's just so hard, how they support it. It supports itself. Like it's a feedback cycle where you'll get a corporation that has a lot of power and money. Like here in our city, we have the developers. Next door in Anaheim, they have the Disney Corporation. They have the money that they can invest in getting people elected. And then they get those people elected and then they just feed it off each other. And then it's very, very hard for someone to come in, like a grassroots movement or just the residents to come in and break that apart. And so I guess maybe off the top of my head, just from my experiences, I think campaign finance reform is really, really key. Try to break that cycle a bit and get those decisions back in the hands of the voters. And I think like Citizens United is a good example of that sort of issue. Here we have, the lobbyists get away with murder, I think literally maybe. So we need to tighten up those things, but I think that would be a good step. But I mean, it is a tough nut to crack.
Thank you.
The federal lobbyists live here.
So right.
Not only local lobbyists, but they're
Yeah.
professionals. It's that we live
Yeah.
together. Okay. Scott Eden has a question, and I'm looking at the time, and I'm thinking we may go over to 8 o'clock. But there's just too many things we want to ask you, Dr. Treseder. Scott, go ahead.
Okay, sure. It's a quick question. Do you know if there's any data on the carbon footprint of a vegan diet versus a regular standard American diet?
I think that there must be. I see Kenneth nodding his head vigorously. So maybe you can put that in the chat.
Yeah.
But yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And Jim, you were going to try to mine the chat to see if we had other things that people had put in the chat that really wanted to be.
I saw something come up in the chat. Nancy mentioned, this sounds like community choice energy program we're trying to pilot. That is exactly it. It is a community choice energy program. Exactly. Just make sure that whoever they hire as a CEO first is not corrupt. That's all. That's just my one piece of advice.
Understand this, gathering that California is not a Dillon's rule state. I'm not sure what that is, like Virginia is. But are the other legislative or executive constraints on implementing, any of the 80 solutions? Do you have those kinds of?
I don't know the Dillon's rule, but I can tell you we do have restrictions that come down. So the state has certain laws that says a city cannot pass a law that restricts such and such. The one thing that really hit us hard in the city was building electrification. So one of the first things that we passed when I came on council was a ban on natural gas hookups in new buildings, because of course natural gas is methane and it leaks and it's just awful. And we were really excited about that. But then right as we passed it, a ruling came down from the Ninth Circuit Court because the restaurant industry had sued the city of Berkeley for a similar ordinance. And the Ninth Circuit judges, there were 3 of them, 2 were Trump appointed, they said, oh, actually, the state law prohibits banning natural gas appliances in homes. And even though that ordinance didn't do that, by banning natural gas hookups, it effectively meant that people couldn't buy natural gas appliances. And so right now our ordinance is in hiatus while we wait for there's an appeal with the Ninth Circuit. So yeah, we run into that too, and it can be challenging. Whenever we are trying to come up with an ordinance, we always have to comb through all the relevant laws at the higher levels, make sure that they're not contradictory. Okay.
Thank you, Jim. Now, I appreciate you asking the question. Yeah, Dillon's rule is a lot of states have it, including Virginia, and Richmond calls the shots on a lot of things. And to get, like in Fairfax County, there may be other people on the line here who know more about this, to get our 5-cent fee on plastic bags that was a stretch to get it because the state easily could have said, no, you can't do that. And so thank you though, Kathleen, you answered the question that I was
Yeah.
concerned about.
We do run into that. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Mary, I don't know if you want to ask your question, if it was answered about the getting back to agriculture.
I think my question was answered. I'm in the Green Party, and we endorsed animal-based regenerative agriculture a long time ago, and we're actually moving away from it toward plant-based regenerative agriculture, simply because there isn't enough land. A biodiversity crisis is it'll be a disaster. Even if you do all grass-fed or silvopasture, all that land that you've saved because you're not growing the grain. First of all, there's usually grain fed at some point in the process, but just the land required, the pasture land it's enormous, and there just isn't enough planet. So I think we need ways to help both eaters, consumers, and farmers. I think we need, Finland had a dairy to berries program to encourage farmers to switch from dairy farming to berries, which are a traditional crop in that area. And I think we need training for farmers and subsidies. And we need to stop subsidizing the animal products that are cheap, because they're not cheap at all. They're subsidized, and all those externalities need to be factored in. So I just think we need policies, and it has to be thought through carefully.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we could subsidize the vegan diet. That would be great. Also, yeah, I agree. So I never want, as one of the things that we're trying to prioritize in the city, at least I am, is making sure that we don't harm any vulnerable communities with whatever our solutions might be, right? So like it's the same thing. Like we don't, like if we have a small family farm, we don't have any in our city, but let's say we did, like we don't want to make things harder for them. So whenever we are working on a policy or an ordinance, we try to set aside like funds to help those small businesses or more vulnerable communities transition. So like if they need a rebate to get an electric powered leaf blower instead of gas powered leaf blower, and it's a family gardening business, then we do that for them. I think that, yeah, we really need to prioritize that. And the last thing I'll say about the vegan diet is that I study the microbiome too, and the gut microbiome is so much better with a vegan diet. Oh my gosh, 100%, especially lentils. If you ever want to improve your gut health, for some reason, we found lentils is the big thing.
You talked about, and how to, and Belgium was an example on this NPR story, was to bring up things like supporting the small farmer that now is being asked to do something that they've never done before.
I mean, I think that I don't have too much I could say for Orange County, although the county is named after orange groves. We just don't really grow too much here anymore. But I think one of the thoughts that we have is, within the state anyway, is that we start with a policy that is like locally relevant and supported. And then a lot of times that will essentially require any corporations or any entities that are working in that area to then essentially adopt those practices across their whole region, because they don't want to make products specifically for that one city or that one county. And then essentially then you end up with like almost automatic scaling up. And that is something that I think could potentially happen if you have, like, let's say you have this Central Valley in California with a lot of agriculture. There will be parts of Central Valley that are where there's more political will for helping boost regenerative agriculture, or trying to even potentially ban practices that are not environmentally friendly. And then if like there's a company that wants to purchase produce or things like that throughout the Central Valley, they'll need to adopt those same sort of standards themselves. And then eventually the whole Central Valley could then adopt the laws and the policies, because they're already being followed and the industry doesn't have a problem with that. That's one of the thoughts for doing it, and to try to kind of monkey wrench along areas that wouldn't be politically inclined to do it otherwise. Does that make sense? Like California mandated a very, very high miles per gallon requirement for our cars. So then basically the car manufacturers that were supplying cars throughout the country had to meet that requirement for all their markets because they didn't want to have separate factories.
Do you have any kind of helpful tips for how we talk with councils?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So it sounds like you already have elected officials who are friendly with your group and all that. So that's wonderful. So it can be very helpful to have a champion. So like I recommend finding, like, instead of trying to send an email like to all the council members about an issue necessarily, and that doesn't hurt, but will get more traction is if you approach the single person who you think is most likely to align with you. And that might involve some cyber stalking in some cases. Look at or find friends, like in their social media profiles, see if you have any friends in common, and you can get through to them that way. That can be very helpful. But yeah, and then ask for meetings, in-person meetings. And it might take a few tries, but that's where I think we really make the most progress. Is I'll sit down in a room with a bunch of people, especially if they're everyday, like just residents, don't seem like they have an agenda, like they're not being paid by corporations or anything like that. That is very persuasive. You get an elected official in a room with people who are all going to lean on them, very friendly like, but lean on them. It's hard to say no. And so that can be very useful. And then of course, speaking at the council meetings, sending the emails as well. And let's see, what else is really good? Oh, kids. So you bring kids in, that is just like silver bullet, like game over. Like they cannot say no to kids. They all gonna want to take the photos with the kids. You get the kids up there in the meetings, you get the kids speaking, giving the public comment. All the council members will be applauding, the audience will be applauding. Can't say no. Kids, Girl Scouts, especially Girl Scouts.
Overshoot of a species, and how every single one that has overshot its carrying capacity of the environment has resulted in a collapse. And you've probably read, some of the projections that that do put us on such a path. How do you talk with council members or others about that, or do you not, and you just keep going at the things that they are familiar with?
It's so hard, and I struggle with that a lot because I've seen the simulations. My husband, he one of the things he's studying the most is catastrophic climate change. Like what is the threshold that if we pass, we're like done, like the human race is done. But if you talk about that, then people will say we're just fear mongering. But then if you don't talk about it and try to be more measured, then they'll say, what's the big deal? Like, why do we have to make all these big changes? And so I think it's pretty tough. And I guess that what I try to do is I try to make it as immediate as possible, like for that person. And I try to get maybe a story out of them. And I'll say where were you at the last wildfire that we had? Like in 2020, that was so scary. Like, were you in any area nearby? And then if they say yes, then I'll be like, oh yeah, you know what? You know why we had that is because it was so dry, because of climate change. And one of the things that we're trying to do about that is to, blah, blah, blah. And then, so then that way your home won't be as in danger. I think, it's a very hard problem to address. And I don't think there's any easy answer, just the way we're wired as a species. But yeah, I try to make it very, very immediate to them, and maybe their kids. It's all true, but something that they can respond to.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for your time here. Do we have any other last words or? I don't wanna-
Here's my take. I'm hoping we could invite you back.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe after like 6 months or so. And I love your advice about lentils and it's being a support. I mean, you know, I was a second grade teacher for a while. I know how irresistible they can be. So
That's
they're
right.
adorable. They're just adorable. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom. I really, really, really appreciate it.
Yeah. I'm always happy to come back, and yeah, you let me know how things are going.
Okay. We'll be your East Coast fan club.
All right, that's good. I need as many as I can have. All right, well, it was wonderful talking with you, and thank you so much for all your hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Really
Thanks a lot.
appreciate it.
Bye.